Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and thanks for tuning in. Today I'm doing something a little bit different with this video. It's a build report of the Meng 148 scale A-18F Super Hornet that I recently completed. I picked this kit up from a local store who was selling off a collection. Since the kit was purchased in Australia, the local distributor included additional markings for an RAA Super Hornet. Also included were Edwards interior and seatbelt etch sets, a Canopy mask set, but there's no need for these masks as there's already a set included within the kit. I also brought the Gloria Models 3D printed intakes. These were a drop fit and were worth every dollar. Now moving on to the build. As Ming's colour callouts were AK paints, I grabbed the Hasegawa instructions from their Super Hornet and converted the colours to Mr. Colour callouts. Once the cockpit components were painted and the photo etch applied, it became clear that there was a noticeable difference in the grey tones. To address this, the original paint was heavily thinned and used as a wash, allowing it to flow naturally into the gaps around the raised detail of the photo etch. The larger flat areas then were carefully blended in using a fine paintbrush. I downloaded an ejection seat file from Cockpit 3D and printed on my Algo Saturn Ultra. Once the print was fully cured, the harness detail was removed so the kit-supplied pilot could sit flushly against the seat. Both pilot figures and the ejection seats were then painted using a range of Vallejo colours. From this point, the rest of the Hornet was assembled, with all the major components test-fitted prior to painting. Overall, the build was hassle-free, although I did run into one small issue with the centre pylon, which didn't sit flush against the fuselage. To fix this, a small amount of Tamiya putty was applied and left to dry for a few minutes. Then the excess was carefully worked and cleaned up using Tamiya lacquer thinner, leaving a smooth flush fit. Before starting the painting process on the Hornet, the mould line on the canopy needs to be removed. My method for this is quite simple and uses just a few basic tools. I use a 7-sided nail buffer, an old reading glass cleaning cloth, and an optometrist glass polish compound to carefully smooth and restore the clear parts. Using the final sanding side of the buffer, I first remove the mould line from the canopy. Then I move on to the next side to even out the surface, followed by the smooth finishing side. Finally, I use the last side of the buffer to restore clarity and add shine by gently buffing the surface. At this stage, the clear parts are usually very clear, but can be further refined with a small amount of polishing compound and a final buff using the soft glass cleaning cloth. Moving on to the painting stage, the Hornet was first primed using Mr. Surfacer Black. For the main camouflage, Mr. Colour C307 was applied to the upper surfaces, while C308 was used for the lower surfaces to complete the scheme. This is where the build went a little sideways. As I hadn't finished the kit in a couple of years, my rescribing skills were a little bit rusty. After 5 attempts on this particular panel line, I decided to fill it, move on rather than risk further damage. The next hiccup came during the gloss coat, which was mixed a little too hot due to the paint to thinner ratio. As a result, some of the underlying paint was affected, so those areas were repainted using the camouflage colours. With the painting complete, the decals were applied. However, no stencil decals were included with the decal sheet that the distributor supplied in the box, and the kit provided stencils were the incorrect colours for this aircraft. To work around this, which included a set of additional stencils suitable for this build, my good mate James over at Replicate Models kindly sent over a couple of Fighting First FA-18 patches along with a 1 squadron patch all the way from Australia. These made a fantastic addition to the display base. I chose the blue patch with the flag as it adds a pop of colour and clearly identifies the model as an Australian Super Hornet. Moving on to my favourite part of the build, weathering. This is where the model really starts to come to life. I begin picking out the panel lines using Ammo Deep Grey Panel Wash, which helps to add depth and definition without being too harsh or overpowering. Once that had time to settle, then I used Ammo Shader Starship Filth, carefully working around selected panel lines and surface details. This step helps to break up the uniform finish adding subtle variations and giving the aircraft a more used operational look. I prefer to build this effect up gradually, keeping everything restrained so it enhances the paintwork rather than overwhelming it. The loadout was selected using reference images from the internet. I decided to use 3D printed ordnance produced on my Algo printer for the stores carried under the wings. The GBU-12 paveways came from Mr. Plowmo and feature an excellent level of surface detail. However, due to how thin the guidance fins are, I found it necessary to print a few spare sets, as a couple were accidentally snapped during handling. The GB38s were also sourced from Colts 3D, included a wide range of optional parts covering both US Navy and Air Force variants, along with 4 different fuse options. The AIM-9X sidewinders were also sourced from Colts 3D and printed as a single one-piece assembly, which made preparation straightforward. Once all the ordnance was painted and attached, the final task was to mount the Hornet to the display base. For this, I used a 7mm acrylic rod sourced from Temu to support the model in the position I wanted. I drilled corresponding holes into both the base and the Hornet itself using a Ryobi power drill, carefully setting the angle and height. This part was a little nerve-wracking, but once everything was aligned and secured, the build was done. With the rise of AI, I've started experimenting by feeding some of my completed model photos into AI image generators. This allows me to place the finished model into a natural real-world environment, helping to visualize how the subject might look in its operational setting. The results can be surprisingly effective, and the examples like these really help to bring the model beyond the bench into contents. And that brings this build to a close. As always, thank you very much for taking the time to watch. It's greatly appreciated. If you enjoyed the build, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to keep up with future projects. I'd also like to say a special thank you to my Patreon supporters. Your ongoing support truly helps make these builds and videos possible. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via my Patreon, which is linked in the comments. Or if you prefer, you can offer one-off support by buying me a coffee. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the next build.